we have seen in the first part what is immunopsychiatry now. And this COVID epidemic changed several things, I think. And yeah, we have already seen this. And of course, if levels, astrocytes and glia do interact, and the immune cells provide the mechanisms for the homeostasis of the brain and of this crosstalk, in the case of such an infection, as we will see, this interaction is disturbed because one of the main findings we can now propose to be written in textbook, I mean, is that in mood disorders there is an imbalance between the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity. And this is what is triggered by COVID infection, as by every new infection. So please remember this, that we have a high panel of cytokines, and I'm telling you these are the same cytokines which are part of the cytokine storm triggered by COVID. So in people who didn't have, who were healthy subjects, okay, the COVID infection triggered a similar phenomenon to what is observed in endogenous depression, and especially by activating innate immunity, which points toward the bipolar spectrum, but in the case of COVID, we still don't know. And going back to the past, and now we can understand better the reasons why these researchers at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine did focus on viruses and on virus infection in mood disorders. The idea is not the idea that a virus does invade the CNS and causes an encephalitis. I mean, it could be possible, this kind of undiagnosed encephalitis are associated with mood disorders and with depression, but what we know now is that the profiles of antibodies, of immune reactions to viral infection is different in patients with mood disorder than in healthy controls. And probably this is one of the reasons why our patients suffered so much about COVID. The relationship goes in the two directions. My talk will be mainly with the fact that COVID can trigger depression. But patients with mood disorders died a lot more than patients without psychiatric conditions, and the death toll was terrible. This is the first meta-analytical work done, and we did it. We coordinated it, Benedetti and me, there's also me somewhere here, the work by gathering data from 33 studies, and you see we arrived at a number of 1.5 million of people. And so we were able, given the high prevalence of mood disorders and of schizophrenia, we were able to calculate which was the risk of dying of COVID if you had already a diagnosis of mood disorder. And you see here, it's terrible. Any mental disorder, odd risk, double. 2. Severe mental illness, including into severe mental illness, psychotic disorders, mood disorders, and substance use disorder, you see that if you are taking illicit drugs, it's less important. Of course, your body will be affected by the effect of the drugs, but you are not the specific problems that probably mood disorder people have. And so we have a 2.2 risk for severe mental illness, which is 2 for psychotic disorders in the broad sense, also including psychotic mania and so on, and depression, major depressive disorder. And you see the use of drugs, antipsychotics, do confirm a risk, but also anxiolytics and antidepressants, and of course these risks overlap with the risk of having an illness. So it was quite terrible. Patients with mood disorder died a lot more. We found 2. And I can find another now, sorry. There are other meta-analyses, more with less people. and they are around 2.7, something like this. So we start with the take-home message directly, which is, in the months following COVID-19, high rates of major depression is expected in survivors. The psychopathological features are the same observed in MDD, distributing along the same magnitude of severity. There is a neurocognitive impairment which can possibly separate from the depressive symptomatology, but in our experience it was not possible to disentangle it until 6 months after COVID. And brain correlates are the same observed in MDD and MDD. The suggestion, as early at the beginning of 2021, was that in the post-COVID outpatient service, there should be always a neuropsychiatrist for screening for depression, post-traumatic symptoms, sleep disturbances, and cognitive impairment. Now we can say also for specific changes in the structure of the brain, which are closely similar to those that are observed in mood disorders. And together with other people who can be involved in this. And I don't know why neuropsychiatrists should examine the patients like on a bed or anything like this, but this is, of course, it's on nature medicine, so I take it as it is. Probably it's a consensus done by the major United States universities about how to deal with these post-acute COVID-19 syndromes. When the world exploded and the virus spread, you know that Italy was one of the first countries that was struck in Europe. And one thing was immediately clear. First, that a lot of people died. Even if at the beginning, the diagnoses were so little because we are always of a few reagents, so they could not be diagnosed. And here you see the diagnosis of the first wave, second wave, third wave, but these are the deaths, okay? The death toll. The second wave was the most horrible, the Delta virus wave, and this is now with the vaccinated people. And everything we have to say about the efficacy of vaccines, I think, can be seen here. I mean, people die less, even if they die. And the views changed. We were here, okay? The day 8th of May 2020 is because it's the point in which we started our observation of post-acute COVID syndromes. Okay? We started our patient service there, the 8th of May. This is Milano. The color is the number of dead people at those times. Okay? And this is Milano, this is the Hospital San Raffaele, this is Bergamo, this is Brescia, which was terribly broken. This is where the first cases were detected in Lodi and towns surrounding. So we are in the middle. And the so-called cytokine storm in COVID is due to the fact that this virus is new. And so, the adaptive immune system takes time in finding a correct clone of lymphocyte that can target the virus, okay, and clean it up from the body. The younger you are, the easier it is to find a clone, because your lymphocytes are virgins, and you never met, you don't have this huge amount of libraries of memory cells which contain all the contacts you had in your life with pathogens and which are not useful, of course. You are a child, you are all your immune system there ready, and COVID is a cold. But if you are older, and my age was 50-something, is the age where the people started to die a lot, your immune system has already met a lot of previous pathogens, so you have a phenomenon which is called immunosenescence. It grew on. You have a lot of memory cells and less naive cells. And this is exactly what we observe, I told you before, in patients with mood disorders. They have, for some reasons, unclear reasons, immunosenescence even in early ages. And so they die more for COVID, as I told you. But during COVID, everybody had an activation of the innate immunity, which happens when the adaptive immunity cannot clean up the virus at the beginning. The other thing that was clear is that COVID is not a pneumonia, it is a systemic infection. These are the organs in the body which express the ACE2 protein, which is the target for the spike protein of the virus. And as you can see here, in most cases, the most affected part was the gastrointestinal tract, and then the kidneys, and then all the endocrine organs. I've seen everything, thyroiditis, orchitis, everything. And then, of course, there are also the pneumonia. It's here, the lung, which doesn't express so much the RNA for this protein. As you can see, the RNA is continuously expressed in the gastrointestinal tract, but it expresses the protein. And pneumonia and attack to the lung is so much important because then you die. I mean, if you have problems in other organs, you can survive them. Of course, if you have acute myocarditis, you can die from myocarditis. But the point is, when inflammation attacks the lung, the tissue of the lungs is so sensitive, so delicate, that it can destroy it, and we need the lung to live. And so we have elderly people with immunosenescence, which have suffered this attack to the lung. Eventually, probably in all of them, the adaptive immune system could have produced the right antibodies to clean out the virus. But in the meantime, they were dead. And this was the situation that we faced in these years. And this attack to the lung triggers and terribly enhances the so-called cytokine storms, because this tissue is so sensitive and fundamental for living that it can immediately trigger very high responses in the immune system. And so, when the virus attacked endothelial cells here, immediately all these populations of cells were overactivated, and there was a massive release of cytokines, leading to the cytokine storms. And the cytokines also involving all these peripheral tissues that I told you contributed to a self-reinforcing mechanisms, a positive feedback mechanisms, which was without solution. Until the virus would have been cleaned out, all the patients are died. We mainly see the patients in our studies in the first wave, and then also in the second wave. I will show you the difference, some of the differences, but in both cases, we had this phenomenon which was being studied in immunology. After an acute infection, which leads to an activation so big of innate immunity, you have either early death or overwhelming inflammation, or a possibility of late death due to persistent immunosuppression and recurrent infections after the first strong infection of the body. This is one of the mechanisms. Homeostasis is here, but here you trigger inflammation with innate immunity. Adaptive immunity is temporarily dampened, and then adaptive immunity can clear the virus, can clear the pathogen, and then you not necessarily stay in the homeostasis. Both for this phenomenon or for this other phenomenon in which intractable inflammation-induced organ injury continues to develop over time. And then if you have this attack to the lungs, and then persistent inflammation into the lungs, and then pulmonary fibrosis and whatever, you could die even of this. What happened to the COVID? We don't know so well. I mean, they are studying it. What seems clear is that innate immunity remains activated in the months following COVID. And this associates with the symptoms that I will show you with depression. So it's a mix of the two things and needs to be studied indeed. So this talk has 4 parts, but they are shorter than before. Okay, they are not so long as the 2 parts. Before, I will stay within my 45 minutes, I think, so everybody will be happy. Because you travel a lot and you are tired for the travel. But anyway, I will try to tell you first the prevalence of post-COVID depression and the psychopathological features mean, we are in the middle of it now, so we don't know so much what will happen in the future. Let's start with the prevalence. This is my paper, but this was, I think now they are more than 800 citations. Okay? Why? Because it was the first one. We were the first to publish a patient surviving COVID had depression, and this was associated with some inflammatory symptoms. And then everybody in the world saw the same thing. So a lot of papers have been published confirming this. I've never seen a thing like this. I mean, I said, okay, let's publish the fact that some of them has depression. And then everybody said, yeah, it's true. It's not mine. I mean, it's a very famous paper, but I don't consider it one of the paper, right? Anyway, what we saw was all the people discharged and surviving COVID in our hospital, and this is an image. It tells us something. I mean, people coming alive out of my hospital at 58 years of mean age. The younger one I've seen was a young woman, 28 years old, who was working in the fashion industry and was arriving in Milan from London and had a fever in the airport. So she was immediately sent to the emergency department, but she was discharged one day after because she was perfect. And I've seen her and she had nothing. But this is an image of people hospitalized and coming out alive. And the point is, we observe post-traumatic distress in 28% of patients, but depression, clinical depression, in 30% of patients, which is very important. And then obsessive compulsive symptoms, insomnia, 56% scored pathological in at least one dimension. We were there. Let's think of this with a net, okay, catching them 1 month after discharge. So we had depression at the beginning of it. It had started, and it was a mild to moderate depression in the majority of cases. Just a few cases had severe depression with even suicidal ideation, but it was a very low number. Most of the cases were moderate, and considering post-traumatic symptoms, you see, they were in the concern area for the possible development of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I tell you immediately that most of the patients went with a pattern of progressive amelioration of this post-traumatic distress, while depression rised over time. And then the epidemiology respected the epidemiology of depression. You see that females, the gender ratio was 3:1 for females in respect to males, as it is the epidemiology of depression of the so-called endogenous depression, not triggered by and then respecting the field studies about the DSM diagnosis, nearly 30% of the patients we saw had a previous DSM-5 diagnosis, and these people had a higher probability of having a second episode. You can see that most of the patients we saw had MDD or a small amount had bipolar disorder, and the others were anxiety disorders. These data, which we, a note about the methodology. What did we do? We gave self-rating scales to the patients, okay? And they could, in this way, self-rate their symptoms on 2 scales for each dimension. We used the Zung self-rating scale for depression and the Beck depression inventory for depression. For post-traumatic concerns, we used the impact of event scale and the PCL-5, and so for insomnia and the other dimensions. Okay? These data were confirmed in the same, nearly the same figures in patients surviving COVID in the United States, where these researchers looked at the clinical interviews booked by the patients in the 6 months following COVID. And the 30% of the patients surviving COVID booked a clinical interview with a psychiatrist. And 13 of them had the first interview in his life. They didn't have any need before of getting in contact with psychiatrists and psychologists. This was the first episode of depression they had. I'm saying of depression because mood disorders had the worst pattern, and you can see that it progressively worsened over the course of the days. These are 3 months, 90 days. Okay, after the recovery from the COVID, we started our study here, but then we followed up the patients at 3, 6, and 12 months after. So it was confirmed, and to put a long story short, I will just show you some of the first meta-analyses that have been published about all the papers describing this epidemiology. As you can see, a lot of scales were used over the world. PH9, SDS, which is the Zoom SDS I told you, the HARTS, which I don't like it so much, the self-rated chemical depression, PH2, SCL9, and so on, so on, so on, so on. And in these meta-analysis, you see 27 studies, 6,000 of patients, estimated depression 37.7. In this other one, 4,000 of people, 38% the same, which also this effect, the gender effects, higher in females than in male patients, the severity of depression, which says that mild depression is the most prevalent because we are at the beginning of it, and so and so. And then in this other one, 4,000 people, 45% of estimated depression, again more females than males, and again amount of mild depression, 33%, 14% moderate depression, 7% severe depression. It's exactly the figures we have observed in our first study. So this is to tell you it's the same everywhere. These are all the studies here. 21%, 41%, and so on and so and so. So we can conclude overall that nearly 30% of the patients surviving COVID has a major depressive episode. When I was first presenting this data in international congresses, they told me, no, they don't have depression, they are fatigued. They don't sleep well. And I said, of course don't sleep well. I've never seen a depressed patient sleeping well. And I've never seen a depressed patient full of energy. Of course they have less energy. Of course they are easily fatigued. These are core symptoms of depression. As the more striking psychopathological features of the depressive syndrome, to test those, I will try to be short, but it's very complicated, but I'm speaking to colleagues, so you know what I'm speaking about. We tried to address the specific cognitive vulnerability of depressed patients in terms of evaluation of emotional events and of emotional stimuli with a positive or negative connotation. Okay? We know that the brain, usually in normal condition, has a mood-congruent processing bias which in healthy people favors the processing of positive stimuli, and the reaction of the brain is slower to negative stimuli. And this is thought as a mechanism that preserves our well-being. We are more impressed, more reactive to what is positive, and we can distract ourselves from what is negative. It's a general rule in the neuropsychology of depression that during the major depressive episode, this mechanism is completely reverted to the opposite. The patients only see bad things. They tell it to us, I see everything dark, I cannot feel anything good. These mood-congruent biases and information processing influence everything, judgment, decision-making, attention, memory, and involve self-deprecation and guilt, and are targeted by antidepressant treatment when it is successful. And so we asked the patient to self-describe themselves with positive or negative adjectives. For instance, if we are brave or wild. These adjectives are moral values. So they are related to the self-deprecation, to the image of themselves. There is not rich and poor, okay? There is I'm a good guy, I'm a bad guy. Oops. And you can see an early study by Benedetti, Barbara Sahaker, and Raymond Dolan from the imaging section, that there are dissociable responses in the anterior cingulate of patients and controls to happy and sad stimuli. And this is, they said, the neural basis of these mid-congruent processing bias. And we did the same in our patients, and we find dissociated response in patients and in controls. Let's see where are the patients and where are the controls. On the right, you have the patients, on the left, you have the controls. You see that anterior cingulate, those lateral prefrontal cortex, do react in healthy people to negative stimuli, and they block the reactivity of the amygdala and of all the cortical limbic circuitry to negative stimuli, and they deactivate for positive stimuli, and so you have greater reactivity to positive stimuli. In the patients, it's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. And what we have shown in an early study in 2007 is that when they heal from depression, this reactivity is restored to normal. Okay? And the brain again reacts more with the top-down control to negative stimuli than to positive stimuli. And so what do we see? Exactly what we see in patients with major mood disorders. Okay, the pattern is the same. So all these mid-congruent processing bias are the same observed in major depression, and this tells us that the two conditions overlap, at least even at this behavioral level, phenotyping behavioral level. Here you see that the ratio between latencies of attribution of positive and negative stimuli favors, one is equal, favors negative stimuli, the rapid reactivity to negative stimuli, which is proportional to the self-deprecation in two groups of patients. Black one are post-COVID patients, the white dot are MDD patients studied before COVID, so not even vaccinated. No contact with COVID. Depressed patients are just worse. And when COVID patients do not have depression, they are absolutely overlapping with healthy controls. But look here, which is the most interesting part of this experiment. This is depression, okay, on the two self-rating, which has this cutoff of 50. And one is the ratio between latencies of attributions and neuropsychological bias. You see that the two cutoffs overlaps in separating non-depressed post-COVID and healthy subjects. And when you look here, you have the process which are NDP and the dots which are COVID, which are completely overlapping, interspersed. There's no difference. You test with this neuropsychological testing, post-COVID depressed patients and NDP, and you see no difference. And you see no difference in self-deprecation, which is along a gradient, okay, from health to the most severe suicidal depression, with COVID patients in between. And by the way, we have shown in previous studies that TNF cytokines do influence the reactivity of the brain in terms of bold responses to emotional stimuli by dampening the reactivity to negative stimuli, okay, in anterior cingulate and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in MDD and BVD. This pattern of altering the neural reactivity of the brain in depressed patients is strictly correlated to the degree of inflammation. And so it is not surprising that in post-COVID depression we have the same. But more interesting even is that when the brain heals, we have shown that stem cell factor, which has immune anti-inflammatory inflammatory effect, stem cell factor is released by neurons, acts on microglia, and dampens microglial activation. And this happens when the patient is healed, and this influences again the reactivity of the brain to emotional stimuli. So, the balance with the cortical control of emotions, both in the brain of patients with major depression and bipolar disorder, and in post-COVID depression, is influenced by the levels of inflammation. We went even deeper. We will need a cognitive psychotherapist to comment properly this, I'm not, but these are the typical Beck's errors, cognitive errors in depression. I translated this questionnaire in Italian a lot of years ago. It's called the cognition questionnaire. You give hypothetical events and evaluate the emotional impact, attribution of causality. Is my fault. Everything goes bad, is my fault. Why? Because I am worth nothing, because I will never be worth nothing. It will always be the same. I will not be worth anything in any situation it can present me. I can't control what's happening in my life, and so on and so on and so on. These kind of errors do correlate with hopelessness, suicide, adverse childhood experience, severity of depression, delusions even in patients with depression. We published a huge literature about this, also studying their correlates and their genetic determinants. And look at the COVID patients again. This is the cognition questionnaire total score. This is the Thumb rating, and you can see that they strictly correlate. Black dots are post-COVID patients, not depressed or depressed. White dots are major depressive. And this is the frequency of self-deprecation, and this is the cognition questionnaire, and these errors, and they go together. So, in summary, for this first point of depressive syndrome, it's the same observed in major depression. Okay? In terms of cognitive vulnerability, cognitive impairment, in the reactivity, both behavioral and in terms of reactivity of the brain to emotional stimuli. And what about the neurocognitive impairment? Well, this is a core point. This is a very complicated table, but just to tell you, we did a battery. I think we are running this battery. We started 3 months after COVID in the first wave. This is a battery to test verbal memory, verbal fluency, working memory, selective attention and processing speed, psychomotor coordination, and executive functions with power of London on the patients. There are normative data for the Italian population for this, which is called the brief assessment of cognition in schizophrenia as a battery. And just look at the percentage. 78% of the sample had poor performance in at least one cognitive domain, with executive functions and psychomotor coordination equaling 50% executive patients, 57% of the sample psychomotor coordination, which is one of the worst impaired. I find it here. I think I do a lot in mistake. If it's making a mistake in this slide, it's 67% of the sample. These deficits do not ameliorate over time. This is the bad thing. This is the bad news. These are 3 groups of patients tested at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months after COVID. 0 is the line of the healthy controls, and these are equivalent scores showing a performance which is worse than healthy controls. The blue line here are major depressed patients with severe depression hospitalized for severe major depressive episode. We know that they have a clinical compromission of cognitive functions. They are much lower in verbal memory, working memory, psychomotor coordination, even verbal fluency, and they are very slowed down, the patients. With a problem in executive functions, and look at the COVID one. First thing to look at fact is that 6 months is the yellow line. It's worse than before. It doesn't get better by itself. Not in this time anymore. And the profile is very closely similar to that of major depressive patients, with the exception of this speed of information processing, which is extremely low extremely slow in major depression. Here it is not yet. But the compromission of executive functions, the psychomotor coordination is very bad. They have problems in coordinating their movements, probably because this inflammation is everywhere. These deficits, together with depression, do impact quality of life. Of course, this is a famous scale for measuring quality of life. It evaluates mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, and the two problems, depression and speed of information processing, executive dysfunction problems, have a major impact on the quality of life of the patients. More, depression strictly correlates with this impairment, and it is the major predictor. Let's go on to fatigue. I'm fatigued of speaking about fatigue. Of course they are fatigued. They are inflammation everywhere. But what is important here again is that if you do a multiple regression analysis with penalized regression, you use the elastic net, which is a way of penalizing the regression and showing a kind of a listing of the most important factors affecting one certain variable, we find that 1 month depressive symptoms is the best predictor of fatigue in the following 6 months. Okay? It wins over any social demographic factor and over factors related to inflammation. But the terrible thing again is that things do not ameliorate by themselves. Here you see ratings of fatigue at 1 week, 1 month, 3, 6, and 12 months, and they go progressively worse. This is the first way. This is the first way. This is fatigue at 6 months and at 1 year. Look at the absolute value. The second way is worse. 1 month, 3 months, 6 months is worse than the first way. Probably the delta values gave the delta variant even more symptoms about this. And now the inflammatory biomarkers, which are easy to study. This is the point. I'm very proud of this because it was under our eyes and we didn't think of it immediately, but then reasoning, we found a clear association with inflammation, which is not an association with the severity of the COVID and with its physical consequences. This paper is not so famous as the first one, but I think it's very important. It's a paper written mainly by our internal medicine colleagues. And they, of course, studied the patients in the follow-up. And there were patients with respiratory dysfunction, persistent pulmonary fibrosis, and uncontrolled blood pressure, and malnutrition. The cognitive impairment did not overlap. It could overlap, of course, but it was not a rule. And testing all these variables, we found that they were independent. Okay, the cognitive impairment, the depressive symptoms, and the anxiety symptoms are not predicted by the degree of physical impairment due to the damage directly produced by the COVID. They are linked with persistent inflammation, which does not correlate with this damage. It has to do more with the immune system. We used this index. Systemic immune inflammation index, they call it. It's platelets per neutrophils on lymphocytes. Okay? It is able to capture both the switch of immunity toward innate immunity, because there are more neutrophils than lymphocytes, and endothelial suffering, which we think is one of the triggers of this long-lasting inflammation. It possibly lasts a lot in the body of our patients. And this predicted in the first paper depression, anxiety, it's the neutrophils for platelets or lymphocytes. Okay? And platelet cells are this marker that mediate the endothelial permeability, recruitment of neutrophils and macrophages. So it goes together with this activation of innate immunity. And it's very sensitive in our experience, and not only in our experience. These are the two papers, because one paper is at 1 month and the other is at 3 months. Here there is this index, and this is BDI, and this is soon the self-depressive ratings in males and in females. And it's clear, the same pattern that we had observed in my previous talk. When these parameters are very low, everything is possible. But when they are high, the patients tend to stratify towards depression. And the 50 is here the score at 3 months. But look here, which is very much interesting, I think. This is the decrease in systemic inflammation from admission to emergency department to 3 months after clearing of the virus. Okay? And this is the amelioration of depression from 1 month to 3 months after clearance of the virus. And if the systemic inflammation decreases, depression ameliorates. Okay, this is an improvement. But if systemic inflammation does not decrease or even worsens, depression worsens. They go together. And just to give you an idea, normal values are lower than 320. Nearly none of the patients had these values at the admission in the hospital, of course. But even after, we found that really a lot of patients having very high values. Okay? Here we come to this retrospective observation. This is not a trial. This is the first way. And think about the situation. Okay, people dying everywhere, and the casks, the corridors, with the dead people and whatever, in the emergency rooms. Some people were treated upon availability. There was a criteria. The most severe people, upon availability of the drugs, were treated with these blockers of cytokines. And Anakinra told you blocks interleukin-1 beta, and tocilizumab blocks interleukin-6. They are these new biological drugs. And they, I can also tell this, didn't have so much effect in preventing death. They were not so much better than cortisone in this, and they were abandoned. Nobody uses them anymore. But a lot of patients were treated. And these drugs are terribly effective in blocking this innate inflammation. And patients treated with these drugs, adjunctive to the treatments, did not develop depression. Here you see lower rates of depression, 16% than I presented before, because all these patients are males. In our observation, no female was administered these drugs, because these drugs were given as a last resort, as a last chance, and they were males, the patients who were dying so much. So 16% against 3% of depressive psychopathology in the months following COVID. Now look at the picture, at the clinical picture, when the patients were discharged from the hospital. These were treated with the best available treatment. They were 55. These had been treated with cytokine blocking agents. They stayed in the hospital more than people with cytokine blocking agents. But you can see they were a bit more severe at the admission. But at the discharge, they were exactly similar in terms of C-reactive protein. But look now at these cell counts, which are not correlated, and we know it from immunopsychiatry. They are not correlated to C-reactive protein, and they are a little correlated with cytokines. Remember my two very previous slides, and I showed you that the pattern of change in this relationship between cells and proteins in the blood is very individual, and we don't know very much about it. So they have the same cycle, but when you look much lower. And now look at the systemic inflammation. At admission, they had the same severity. I tell you again, normal values is below 320, and they have 1,069, 1,700. But then the discharge, look here, they were 1/2, and they did not develop depression. And so it is possible that these inflammatory markers are good and can capture this innate immune activation persistent over time. The most investigated markers we found in the literature, we have read an article about this, you will soon find it. It will be published on CNS drugs. It's not yet out, I think. The most investigated were C-reactive protein, TNF-alpha, interleukin 6 and 10, but also a lot of neutrophil lymphocytation. And most of them found effects. 4 studies associated post-COVID depression with neutrophil lymphocytation, 4 studies with C-reactive protein, 3 studies with the systemic immune inflammation index I told you, neutrophil count in 2 studies, interleukin 6, 1, 8, 10, but these are all single studies, so they are not statistics, they are single studies again. A lot of works need to be done, and no data is available about immunophenotyping because there are only 2 studies available, and one study finds remarkable interest in finding lower CD4 to CD8 ratio correlating with depression and higher interleukin 6 and 10, but another study found exactly the opposite, higher CD4 associated with depression and lower interleukin. When these 2 studies were performed in groups with very different ages, so probably a lot of work is needed. We cannot take conclusions on this. But I would strongly advise you in your clinical practice to do what I do, and so to take the blood counts of the patients and calculate these things. You will not find it, you have to calculate yourself. Because in both Italy, these are not us, this is another group, and in Wuhan, this index outperforms CDR in predicting depressive outcomes in the patients. And it's strongly, this is the review published now, it's strong, these 2 indexes are strongly associated. Now look at this single patient. This is one patient who has been followed by these 2 guys in Australia for 4 months. At the beginning, before COVID, his systemic inflammation index is normal, it's 2050. And then it goes up, and then it starts having this waxing and waning course over 4 months. And every time systemic inflammation peaks, the patient has problems. Neurological problems, thromboembolic events. It's a good way of following the patients, of monitoring them, spending not too much money, I think. Because, look here, I told you 78% of the sample had a poor performance in at least one cognitive domain, psychomotor coordinator and executive functions were the worst. And you can see here again verbal fluency, verbal memory, attention information processing, and so and so and so are clearly related with the systemic inflammation at the admission in the emergency department. These are cognitive functions tested 3 months after discharge from the hospital, and this is the inflammation at the admission in the emergency department. It still predicts what happens 3 months later in terms of how they call it, brain fog, the cognitive compromisions. So these are good biomarkers, okay? And I like them very much. Now the brain imaging products. We don't know so much. Because there are clinical studies. I made one of them. And I have another interpretation. And so it will be very quick, but very consistent with all what we have said in the previous talk. First of all, the brain suffers a lot during COVID. We know that this nerve invasion is not happening. there is no encephalitis, there is not neurons plenty of viruses. But we used another, and we have a little brains to perform our process, of course, so we are quite sure of this. We studied this. These are neurofilament light chain, which are a core part of the microstructure of the axon. Think of the microtubules of the axons, okay? They are very strong, very resistant, but they need to be kept in the middle of the axon, because otherwise the axon will grow. It's a double layer, it's very sensitive. What keeps them there? It's the neurofilaments, which are very much strong. And when the axons suffers, or the neuron suffers, it releases neurofilaments. And you can find them in the blood, in the periphery. There are an accepted marker of brain suffering in neurology. If normal values are 2, 3, 4 picograms, let me see, you have 200 in multiple sclerosis and 2,000 in SLA or was pathologies. Normal values are 2, 3. You see that COVID patients during the acute phase can arrive at 300. And these neurofilaments are a predictor of death. Dead people have higher levels than people who survive COVID. But all of them arrive at very high levels, and their mean is much more what you would expect in healthy people. These are all markers of neuronal suffering. So the brain suffers. And this is submitted again. I was rejected 2 times. I thought it was so much important that I was happy to even that got me rejected 2 times by Prof. They did it. The first one said, "Oh, it's not important." It's not important. It's a core part of this reasoning because it shows you that the neurofilaments, you can see here, think that only a few of them are in the normal range. Okay, 20. Is already much higher than the normal range. But they are predicted by age, of course, because older patients suffer more. And they are predicted by C-reactive protein, both in A's and definase. And they are predicted by a panel of cytokines, which we detected with machine learning methods, this penalized regression. And here we use the mass lines, okay, multivariate adaptive regression lines to identify among a panel of cytokines which one predicted them. And we CRP, interleukin 8, interleukin 9, neotaxin, MIP1 beta, interleukin 4 even, in males predicting the level of neurofilaments. So the worse the inflammation, and especially markers of immune during the acute COVID, the worse the levels of neurofilaments in the brain and around. These levels were also predicted by the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Okay? And so, this can explain the suffering of the brain. The results of this beautiful paper published on the patients of the UK BioLab who had been tested before COVID and were then tested after COVID. And you can see that there were differences in CSF, lateral ventricle volumes, temporal cortex, superior frontal occipital fasciculus in terms of diffusion tension. Patients with COVID suffer a reduction in brain volume, brain matter volume, and an increase in water in the brain, which is not good. And in certain areas, this effect was worse, and you can see that it was also strikingly related with age. At younger ages, but you know, these are patients surviving pneumonia from COVID, so they are old. You can't find people with 20 years old because they didn't have pneumonia. You can see here, at my age, you can even survive without many changes. But when you go on, you have a progressive decrease in brain volumes in respect to controls. Okay? And come now to our study, which is the only one which associated symptoms and neurocognitive impairment with brain of patients. We published it end of 2021. We have 42 COVID survivors because we excluded all the patients who had an acute effect of COVID on the brain. So every patient who had even a little spot of hemorrhagic spot or any kind of hypoxia suffering on the brain was excluded. These are all normal appearing brains. The neurologists say it's okay. There's nothing. And we show that inflammation associated with MRI measures and those of psychopathology associated with MRI measures. But first of all, again, in this sample, which is independent from the other, inflammatory markers predicted what happened, predicted depression, predicted post-traumatic stress, predicted, and the female associated with more severity of depression and effects in the same direction were observed for CRP. So both systemic inflammation and C-reactive protein predicted what I will show you, which is, first of all, gray matter volumes associates with psychopathological symptoms in 4 areas of the corticolytic circuitry, which have been associated with mood disorders. The most important, we found a striking association. All the analyses were performed in the brain, in outside areas, but it popped up the anterior cingulate cortex as being associated, you see, negatively, both with BDI and Zimmer ratings for depression. And then insula, which was most associated with hyperarousal and intrusion symptoms of post-traumatic stress. There is a huge literature about all this. We know that the anterior cingulate cortex is reduced and the insular cortex are reduced in the brain of mood disorder patients. And we also know that in particular the subgenual cortex, the historical papers by Ogun and Drevitz showed us that the subgenual prefrontal cortex is reduced, you see, at a half of its volume because glial cells are less and neurons are all packed and disconnected. And these are the core studies in postmortem brains. So these are the areas of depression in the brain of mood disorder people, and we found exactly the same in the brain of our post-traumatic stress patients. And then we studied myelination and DDI. And please, the main effect which is striking, we found it on axial diffusivity, which is a measure of the axonal microstructure, and which can be then closely related to the finding we had of higher levels of neurofilaments in the blood. You see, and this just to remember that in patients with mood disorder, we associated these same agents with circulating cytokines, with cognitive performance, with, and so we have already said. Okay, this is the cause line of this talk. Because these are measures of axial diffusivity, throughout the brain it is reduced proportional to the levels of systemic inflammation or of C-reactive protein. You should see that all white matter skeleton here, it's depicted in red, and we can see it so well, but this is in a glass gray image, okay? And you see the whole white matter skeleton impacted by inflammation in the emergency department, predicting the structure of white matter mean 3 months after discharge from the hospital. It's horrible, because it tells us that this kind of stuff had a long-lasting effect on the brain. And this takes a lot of time to recover. And this also explains us why symptoms are so persistent, because if the axons are damaged, it takes time. This is new, not yet published. I did the analysis last week. It's in preparation. We have 60 patients, and we asked them, how is it going on COVID? How are you now? How is it your concentration, cognitive function? And 30 of them said, it's okay, as before. I can concentrate, I can work. But other 29 said, no, I'm not the same man. It's diminished. I can't stay concentrated. I have problems. It's subjective, okay? Subjective deficits of cognition after COVID. Again, nearly 3 months after COVID. And you can see that the two groups are separated clearly, and what differentiates them is an increasing fraction of an isotopy and an increasing water in mean diffusivity throughout the white matter of the patients with subjective complaints. So subjective complaints and cognitive functions are associated with white matter integrity. Also, a bit psychopathological symptoms, severity of psychopathology, in particular of post-traumatic distress and anxiety, is associated with these changes in white matter structure, and not just a bit for PDI. But these results are not striking and they need a further study. This will take 1 hour to explain, because this is an analysis of resting state connectivity performed with a machine learning technique, which is the multivariate pattern analysis, which studies what connectivity, functional, is impacted by inflammation and what it has to do with. We found several points in which several seeds which are impacted by systemic inflammation. And you can see that systemic inflammation negatively associates with resting state functional connectivity in the default network, in the language and frontoparietal networks. And so of course you are cognitively impaired. I mean, it's not surprising in a way. If you have a suffering of white matter and of the axons, you will have a problem with functional connectivity. Well, it's exactly this. Okay? We show it indeed. While other networks we start linked with anxiety, attention, science, sensory motor are heightened. Okay? These functional changes also associate with post-traumatic distress and anxiety. The bottom-up impact associated with post-traumatic distress, and the lack of top-down control associated with post-traumatic distress. And by the way, we have shown that in the brain of our bipolar patients, you can see here, these top-down influences from those lateral prefrontal cortex inhibiting amygdala through the anterior cingulate are much lower than in head controls, and this impairment in the top-down frontal limbic control associates with the worst symptoms of depression, including suicide. And so what happens in the future of our patients? We don't know so well, because we don't know so much about the natural cause of this. But what I suspect is that it should be the same that we observe in major depression. We know that the major depressive episode, untreated, can last 3 years. We know it from the beginning of scientific psychiatry. And we have treatment-resistant patients who can stay back for 1 year, 2 years into depression. And I think here we will have a similar situation, because look at this meta-analysis done not by me. These are studies, and you see what has been observed at 3, 6 months and at 1 year. And anosmia, dysgeusia do not change. I remember I had COVID, actually, of course. I was there, and I got it, and it was not nice. I can tell you, I'm still not perfectly good. And I had it in March 2020, and in January 2021, just to be a personal anecdote, I like a lot of spicy things, as you told you also appreciate. I like all the spicy things, and I buy something, some Eastern thing, already prepared. And then I said, well, that's rubbish, but what, we never buy this again because it has no taste. It seems, powder, it seems nothing. And my daughter said, Papa, it's spicy, very high spicy. And I said, good. Okay. 1 year after, these neurons are not yet reconnected with the receptors on the nasal, across the cricoid, I don't know how to say it in English, cricoid family, okay? And these symptoms will stay there. Myalgia will become a little worse, but what will really become worse is anxiety, brain fog, cognitive dysfunction is already high and will stay there. Fatigue will worsen and depression will go worse and worse over time. Does not heal by itself. This is a study I think we published it. Yeah, we published now. There is a very high correlation between depression at 6 months and depression at 1 year. They strictly correlate. Okay? Patients will not heal by themselves, but as you can see here on the left side, females and males will both have a progressive amelioration from 1 to 6 to 12 months in PTSD symptoms. And anxiety will stay where it is basically and ameliorate in women. But in the case of depression, the high rates of depression in women will tend to diminish, but they will tend to grow in males, and at the end we will have, again, 30% of patients having depression. These gender effects, I strongly suspect, has to do with the immune system, which is so much different between women and males, but this is the only finding we have in the literature. We published it and we didn't study this because we had no money and time. But I'm going deep into it, trying to understand if they are related. Finally, two good news, two last slides. First, we performed an open trial. It's not a randomized way, okay? We were there and we started giving antidepressants to patients. And we started with SSRIs, you can see paroxetine, citalopram, sertraline. And in 1 month, Hamilton scores went down so quickly in males and in females in the same way. And with positive history of mood disorders or not, we had an immediate effect of antidepressants openly administered in post-COVID depressed patients. These are not exactly the patients I showed you. These are patients who develop a full-blown depressive episode, needing treatment, okay? Not just a bit of problems in attention. And they responded so well. I think, I was joking about this before, answering to your question, I think it is because most of these patients are at the beginning of their history. It's their first depressive episode. They are mid-54 age. And at the beginning of their psychiatric history, they take an antidepressant and they respond. So this is a good news. The second good news is that we developed a rehabilitation program based on neurocognitive function. It's a computer-assisted neurorehabilitation. It's a bit complicated and it takes a lot of time and work. But luckily I had some volunteers and I could organize this. The patients do make exercises targeted on the deficits they have. Okay? It's there's a lot of neurocognitive packages like this in the literature, and they have been studied also to improve response in major depression. We use them in COVID, adapting them. So the patients came once a week for 6 weeks to perform a 2-hour session of exercises, and then they had some homework also based on their profile of deficits, which you see here. It's the same I showed you before. And you can see that the patients treated with this rehabilitation program, which was focused mainly on executive functions, had a strong amelioration in those, while the other patients have not so much significant changes. And changes in verbal fluency in our models, but these are very few patients. Changes in verbal fluency and mainly in executive functions also did positively influence an amelioration in the quality of life. So something can be done. I mean, the brain is, neuroplasticity is still there. We have inflammation, of course, but the brain will respond if one targets it with exercise and try to recover. Axons are plastic, okay? It's the essence of neuroplasticity, synapses, axons continuously moving and connected. And so we have some hints. You can see here a mean value, patients treated went much better. And so what is immunopsychiatry after COVID? Well, which mechanisms can sustain such a persistent low-grade inflammation after viral infection? Endothelial damage, platelet activation, aberrant expression of gene transcripts, retrotransposon, the activation of human endogenous retrovirus, which has been associated with COVID infection and mortality, and which can persist. We need to study this. And what I think is that studying these effects, we have a way of also studying what happens in depression, and we need some means to return back to our patients. And what role as psychiatry? I think we are at the interface between internal medicine and other neurosciences, and we need to bridge at least some gaps with a translational and reverse translational perspective to achieve prevention, prediction of outcome, precision therapy. And so going back to the first slide, the study of post-acute COVID-19 syndrome proved the importance of the close association between altered immune inflammatory response and major depression. It's a kind of a horribly terrible natural experiment to prove it. Nature told us, we are studying this, look at the real thing. And the real thing is there, confirming our hypothesis about the balance between adaptive and innate immunity in mood disorders. And I think also ongoing efforts will define new therapeutic targets and treatment strategy for the pharmacotherapy of mood disorders, mainly focusing on this arterial inflammation. You find here all the guys. That's me taking my bright light therapy in the morning to survive the Milano winter and the cold season. And you can see here all the guys who made this possible. This is Mario Mazza, who is a psychiatrist and also a PhD student, and he is also here. And you find him as a first name of most of my papers. And this is Mario Paladini, who joined us to test neurocognitive rehabilitation, and these are all my researchers, which are all young, enthusiastic, and much more clever and fit than me. Okay, thanks very much.